In the winter of 1426, inside the inner quarters of the Forbidden City, the air was heavy with incense and unspoken rules. Lantern light flickered against red walls that had witnessed generations of obedience and quiet disappearance. Behind carved doors guarded by eunuchs sworn to silence, women waited, not for freedom, not for justice, but for instruction. Every breath they took belonged to the empire. Every word they spoke could become evidence. In this place, disobedience did not require rebellion. Sometimes it required nothing more than hesitation. Imperial China did not rule its inner palace through spectacle. It ruled through fear made routine, through isolation refined into policy, through punishments designed not to end life, but to erase it.
For concubines who failed to comply, who offended, resisted, or were merely suspected of disloyalty, the consequences were carefully hidden from official celebration. No public trials, no dramatic records, only sealed courtyards, reassigned names, and lives that continued under conditions no person should endure. This is not a story of chaos, it is a story of order, of a system so disciplined that suffering could be administered quietly, repeatedly, and without witnesses. And it is the story behind the title, spoken only in whispers. What Imperial China did to disobedient concubines was worse than death. To understand how such a system functioned, we must first understand the world that created it.
By the time the Ming Dynasty reached its height in the 15th century, the imperial court had become the most controlled environment on Earth. The emperor was considered the axis of harmony between heaven and the human world. His stability was believed to determine floods, harvests, and the fate of millions. Everything surrounding him existed to protect that balance, including the women brought into his household. Concubines were not wives, but they were not servants either. They occupied a carefully defined category, shaped by Confucian philosophy, legal codes, and ritual hierarchy. Selected from across the empire, often as teenagers from respectable families, they were taken into the palace through a process that stripped them of identity before they crossed the gate.
Their names were replaced, their movements restricted, their families cut off. From that moment forward, their survival depended entirely on obedience. This obedience was not limited to behavior, it extended to emotion, silence, posture, and memory. A concubine was expected to accept favor without pride, neglect without resentment, and punishment without protest. Any deviation could be interpreted as disorder, and disorder, in the imperial worldview, was dangerous. Inside the palace, power did not flow openly. It moved through rumor, perception, and invisible hierarchies, enforced by senior consorts, court officials, and eunuchs who controlled access to information. A single accusation could travel upward without evidence.
A misunderstanding could become policy. In this environment, disobedience did not always mean refusal. Sometimes it meant surviving too long. Sometimes it meant being remembered when someone else wished to be forgotten. Official histories describe the inner palace as regulated and harmonious. What they omit is how harmony was maintained. Punishment within the imperial household was rarely recorded in detail, not because it was rare, but because it was considered internal correction rather than criminal action. What happened behind the walls was categorized as domestic management, beyond the concern of historians. This classification allowed severe mistreatment to exist without leaving a visible trace.
Disobedient concubines were not executed in public squares. They were reassigned, isolated, restricted, or subjected to prolonged conditions designed to exhaust resistance. Some were confined to remote palace wings, where time lost meaning. Others were forced into labor framed as discipline. Still others were erased administratively, declared unfit, impure, or invisible. Their lives continued, but outside recognition. So the alive under these conditions was not survival in any meaningful sense. It was endurance without future. What made this system particularly devastating was its psychological precision. Punishment was rarely immediate. It unfolded slowly. A favor withdrawn, a name removed from records.
A room reassigned, meals delayed, instructions delivered through intermediaries who never explained the reason. The uncertainty was intentional. Fear thrives where explanation is denied. Many concubines did not know what rule they had broken. They only knew that something had changed. Some had been accused of influencing the emperor improperly. Others were suspected of alliances with rival factions. A few were blamed for misfortunes beyond their control, failed harvests, political unrest, or the emperor's declining health. In a worldview that linked cosmic order to personal behavior, blame did not require logic, it required convenience. For these women, there was no appeal process. Confession offered no relief.
Silence offered no protection. Once marked as disobedient, their fate was sealed not by law, but by administrative neglect. They became people the system no longer needed to acknowledge. This is where imperial punishment diverged from death. Execution ends suffering. Erasure prolongs it. Records from palace memorials and later court critiques reveal patterns without detail. Sudden disappearances from rosters, notes about relocation for health, references to women who no longer served. These phrases appear repeatedly, always without explanation. The absence itself is the evidence. What makes these stories difficult to reconstruct is not a lack of cruelty, but the efficiency with which it was concealed.
The empire did not want martyrs. It wanted stability. Public violence created questions. Quiet suffering preserved order. The concubines understood this. They learned quickly that resistance did not provoke confrontation. It provoked silence, and silence was far more dangerous. Even those who survived punishment carried its mark indefinitely. A woman once disciplined was rarely restored. Her reputation followed her like a shadow. Other concubines avoided her. Eunuchs delayed her requests. Officials treated her as a liability. She existed, but without influence, without protection, and without the possibility of reversal. This social death was not accidental. It was the intended outcome. The imperial court believed that fear was more effective when it was visible but unexplained.
When one woman disappeared, others took note. When no reason was given, they imagined their own vulnerability. In this way, punishment extended beyond its target. It became instruction. This is why the system endured for centuries. What is often misunderstood about Imperial China is that its most severe controls were not enforced through constant violence, but through the anticipation of it. The women of the inner palace lived under permanent evaluation. Every gesture could be interpreted, every relationship scrutinized, every word remembered by someone whose loyalty was to the system, not to them. And yet, despite this, traces remain. Later scholars pieced together fragments from poetry, private letters, and marginal notes written by officials who served briefly and left disturbed.
These sources speak not of spectacle, but of emptiness, of rooms sealed and never reopened, of women who vanished without ceremony, of lives absorbed into the machinery of governance. These fragments matter because they reveal intent. This was not cruelty born of chaos, it was cruelty refined into administration. If examining these hidden systems of control matters to you, if confronting how history disguises suffering behind formality feels necessary rather than optional, this is the mission of Dark Inquest history. Not to dramatize the past, but to expose what official records preferred to smooth over. As we move deeper into this story, the question is no longer whether disobedient concubines were punished.
That is beyond doubt.
The question is how far the empire was willing to go to ensure that obedience appeared voluntary. Because the most effective form of control is not force, it is making submission feel inevitable. In the next phase of this investigation, we will follow how these punishments escalated, how fear was institutionalized across generations of concubines, and how the system adapted to silence resistance without ever naming it. As the years passed, the mechanisms of control inside the imperial palace grew more refined. What had begun as a system to manage hierarchy became an apparatus designed to anticipate disobedience before it could fully form. By the mid-Ming period, the inner court no longer relied on reaction.
It relied on preemption. Concubines were monitored not only for actions, but for tendencies. Who spoke too carefully? Who asked too few questions? Who received attention without seeking it? These observations were logged quietly, passed through layers of authority, and interpreted according to shifting political needs. In such an environment, guilt did not require proof, it required narrative usefulness. Punishment, therefore, evolved into something less visible and more enduring. A woman suspected of disobedience might not be confronted at all. Instead, her access would change. She would be excluded from ceremonies. Her name would be omitted from rotations, her attendance reassigned. These were not dramatic acts.
They were administrative decisions, framed as routine. Yet they carried a clear message: you are being watched, and you are no longer trusted. For many concubines, this stage was worse than formal discipline. It created a permanent state of uncertainty. They did not know whether they were being tested, forgotten, or slowly removed. Every day became a calculation. Every silence felt deliberate. This ambiguity was not accidental. Imperial governance valued control that left no fingerprints. Within the palace, obedience was reinforced through comparison. Women were ranked, observed, and subtly pitted against one another. Favor was not distributed evenly. It was used strategically, withdrawn without explanation, restored briefly, then removed again.
This cycle conditioned behavior. It taught concubines to internalize surveillance, to regulate themselves more strictly than any external authority could. Disobedience under such conditions was rarely open defiance. It was emotional fatigue, quiet resentment, loss of hope. These internal responses, though invisible, were treated as threats. When a concubine was deemed beyond correction, the response was escalation. Historical records describe reassignment to auxiliary duties, a phrase that appears benign until examined closely. These duties often involved isolation from the social center of the palace, separation from peers, and prolonged confinement to marginal spaces. The woman was not imprisoned in the legal sense. She was removed from relevance. In Confucian society, identity was relational. One's status depended on visibility within a hierarchy. To exist without recognition was to exist without meaning. The empire understood this deeply. Some concubines were sent to serve in ancestral halls or ritual storage areas, places associated with memory and absence. Others were confined to outer compounds under the supervision of officials with no incentive to report on their condition. These transfers were permanent. Once removed, return was almost unheard of. What made these punishments particularly effective was their legality. They did not violate law, they were law. Imperial codes granted the household broad authority to discipline internally.
This autonomy ensured that suffering remained classified as management, not abuse. As long as no public disturbance occurred, no inquiry followed. Silence was both the method and the outcome. The psychological impact of this system cannot be overstated. Concubines lived with the knowledge that their lives could be narrowed without warning, not ended, but reduced. Reduced to routine, reduced to obscurity, reduced to waiting.
Waiting, in this context, was its own form of suffering. Some women waited for summons that never came. Others waited for acknowledgement that their status still existed. Many waited for permission to hope. None of these were granted. Occasionally, a concubine attempted to resist quietly.
She might appeal to ritual correctness. She might reference precedent. She might seek mediation through senior women. These efforts rarely succeeded. The system was designed to absorb them without response. Resistance, when detected, was reframed as instability. At this stage, the punishment shifted again, not toward spectacle, but toward finality. Certain concubines were labeled as disruptive influences. This designation carried no explanation and required no defense. It allowed the court to remove them from palace life entirely while maintaining the appearance of order. Their names were struck from ceremonial lists. Their personal histories collapsed into a single phrase, no longer present.
This was not death. It was disappearance with continuity, a life extended without identity. The empire preferred this outcome because it left no moral residue. No execution demanded justification. No grave required commemoration. The woman simply ceased to matter. For those who remained, the lesson was unmistakable. The inner palace became a space governed by self-erasure. Women learned to minimize presence, suppress memory, and align themselves with invisibility. Survival meant becoming indistinct. It meant avoiding attachment, ambition, or recognition. In this way, the punishment of a few reshaped the behavior of many. Later dynasties inherited these practices with minor adjustments. The Qing court, in particular, formalized palace discipline into elaborate protocols that further distanced authority from consequence.
By then, the system had proven its effectiveness. It no longer needed innovation. It needed only repetition. What history often presents as cultural tradition was in reality institutional fear. If you find yourself disturbed not by what is openly described, but by what is systematically hidden, if understanding how power maintains itself through quiet harm feels essential, then you are already part of the work Dark Inquest history exists to continue. This is not about judgment. It is about recognition. As we move closer to the core of this system, we must confront its most unsettling feature: how easily it justified itself, how punishment was reframed as harmony, how suffering was classified as necessity.
In the next section, we will examine the moment when discipline crossed into irreversible outcome, how certain concubines reached a point beyond return, and how the palace ensured that even their memory could not challenge imperial authority. By the time a concubine reached the final stage of imperial discipline, the process no longer resembled punishment in any conventional sense. There were no raised voices, no visible restraints, no public declarations of guilt. The system had already decided that correction was no longer required. What followed was resolution. This was the point at which the empire ceased to manage behavior and instead managed absence. Women who reached this stage were no longer treated as individuals with potential value.
They were treated as unresolved risks. In a court obsessed with balance and control, unresolved risks could not be tolerated. Stability demanded closure, even if that closure remained invisible. Historical fragments suggest that this phase often began with administrative language, a brief notation, a reassignment order, a ritual exemption. On paper, nothing appeared unusual, but within the palace, everyone understood the meaning. This woman would not return. The locations associated with this final removal were deliberately ordinary. There were no dungeons in the cinematic sense, no theatrical spaces of suffering. Instead, there were quiet compounds, service quarters, and isolated halls far from the emperor's daily movement.
These spaces existed to contain people who were no longer meant to be seen. Once transferred, communication ceased. Concubines in this condition were cut off from the social mechanisms that defined palace life. They no longer participated in ritual calendars. They received no updates. Their names were not spoken. This isolation was not temporary, it was indefinite. What made this stage especially devastating was the denial of narrative. The women were never told why their lives had narrowed to this point. There was no explanation to accept, no accusation to refute, no charge to understand. Meaning was withheld entirely. From the empire's perspective, this was not cruelty, it was efficiency.
In Confucian governance, order was achieved by ensuring that every element occupied its correct place. A concubine who disrupted harmony, even unintentionally, was considered misaligned. Correction had failed. Removal restored balance. The moral calculus ended there. This logic allowed the court to act without reflection. For the women affected, the experience was one of suspended existence. Days passed without markers, seasons changed unnoticed, time lost structure. Without role or recognition, the self began to dissolve. This was not an accident, it was the final objective. Imperial punishment sought not only obedience, but transformation, to reduce a person until resistance no longer made sense.
Some women survived these conditions for years, others did not. Official records do not distinguish between the two. Both outcomes were acceptable to the system. What mattered was that the problem no longer influenced the living court. Occasionally, a concubine disappeared so completely that even palace staff whispered about it. These moments caused brief unease, but the design of the system prevented inquiry. No one was responsible. Authority was diffused. Fear discouraged memory. Silence closed the gap. Later historians struggled with these gaps. They found references to women whose service ended abruptly, whose burial records were missing, whose family petitions went unanswered. These were not anomalies.
They were features of governance. The absence of detail was intentional. It is important to understand that these practices were not driven by cruelty alone. They were driven by ideology. The imperial court believed that individual suffering was insignificant compared to cosmic order. A single life weighed nothing against the harmony of the realm. This belief justified everything. Even those within the system recognized its cost. Private writings from scholars and officials occasionally expressed discomfort, though always cautiously. They spoke of unease, of shadows within the palace, of measures best left unexamined. None challenged the structure openly. To do so would invite the same fate.
Fear enforced loyalty upward as effectively as it enforced obedience downward. At this point in the story, we reach the core truth behind the title. What Imperial China did to disobedient concubines was worse than death. Not because the system was uniquely violent, but because it denied the most basic human closure. Death ends narrative. This system prolonged it without meaning. To live without identity, without future, without acknowledgement, was a punishment designed to outlast resistance. This realization forces a difficult question. How many lives were reduced this way, and why are they absent from our understanding of history? The answer lies in how history is written. Imperial records prioritized continuity.
They documented successions, reforms, and rituals. They did not record lives deemed administratively irrelevant. Women of the inner palace existed only insofar as they supported imperial function. When they ceased to do so, they ceased to be recorded. This is how erasure becomes policy. Yet traces remain, precisely because the system was so rigid. Patterns emerge, repeated phrases, sudden omissions, entire sections of household rosters left blank. These absences speak louder than description. They tell us that obedience was not merely expected, it was enforced through existential threat.
Midway through this investigation, it becomes clear that remembering these women is not an act of sympathy.
It is an act of correction. By acknowledging how power operated behind closed doors, we challenge the narratives that portray empire as orderly and benevolent by default. If you are still listening at this point, you are already participating in that correction. This is why dark inquest history exists, not to sensationalize suffering, but to confront the systems that normalized it. As the imperial era declined, these practices did not vanish overnight. They softened, adapted, and rebranded, but their influence lingered in court culture, gender expectations, and institutional silence. Even after dynasties fell, the logic of quiet removal remained. The women affected by this system left no monuments.
No official testimonies, no recognized legacy. What survives is implication, pattern, absence. And absence, when examined carefully, becomes evidence. In the final part of this documentary, we will look at what followed these hidden punishments, how the empire justified itself after the fact, how cultural memory absorbed these losses without acknowledging them, and why confronting this history still matters now. As imperial dynasties weakened and reforms slowly reshaped court life, the system that governed concubines was never publicly confronted. It was not dismantled through confession or apology. It simply faded from visibility, folded into new customs, renamed as progress. What remained untouched was the silence.
The empire did not preserve the stories of the women it disciplined into obscurity. Instead, it preserved its own continuity. Official chronicles recorded emperors, wars, and decrees. They celebrated order restored and crises avoided. They did not ask what had been sacrificed to achieve that stability. The women of the inner palace were treated as instruments of harmony, not as historical subjects. This selective memory shaped how later generations understood Imperial China. The court appeared disciplined, ritualized, controlled. What was missing were the lives absorbed to maintain that image. For centuries, scholars accepted this absence as normal. The lack of detail was interpreted as insignificance.
If names were missing, it was assumed they did not matter. This assumption became tradition, and tradition became truth. Only when historians began reading against the record did another picture emerge. Petitions from families seeking information that never came. Poetry written in exile that hinted at lives cut short in meaning rather than breath. Marginal notes from officials who hinted at internal matters best left unspoken. These fragments did not tell complete stories, but together they revealed a pattern too consistent to ignore. Imperial punishment was designed to leave no trace, but systems leave shadows. The fate of disobedient concubines forces us to confront a deeper reality about power.
The most effective systems of control do not rely on constant force. They rely on compliance shaped by fear of disappearance. They teach individuals that survival requires erasing parts of themselves until nothing remains worth punishing. This is why the punishment was worse than death. Death ends the struggle between authority and self. Erasure prolongs it endlessly. The women subjected to this system were not rebels in the conventional sense. Many did nothing extraordinary. Some spoke at the wrong moment. Some were associated with the wrong faction. Some simply existed when the court needed a warning to others. Their punishment was not proportionate to their actions. It was proportionate to the empire's need for control.
In remembering them, we do not assign modern judgment to the past. We restore balance to historical understanding. We acknowledge that order was purchased at a human cost, and that cost was deliberately hidden. Their lives mattered not because they were powerful, but because they were controlled. Their suffering matters not because it was dramatic, but because it was systematic. History often teaches us what empires built. It rarely teaches us who they diminished to do it. The silence surrounding these concubines was not accidental. It was the final act of punishment. To deny them memory was to ensure that obedience extended beyond life, beyond record, beyond acknowledgement. Breaking that silence is not an act of outrage.
It is an act of accuracy. If preserving the memory of those history tried to erase matters to you, if examining how power disguises harm behind ritual and order feels necessary, then this work continues with dark inquest history, not to sensationalize the past, but to ensure that absence is no longer mistaken for insignificance. Because the most lasting punishment an empire can impose is not death, it is forgetting.